Welcome to the Brussels studio. My name is Laura Hazanov and I'm joined by Sensei Hofstede, the head of the China team here at the Brussels Bureau of AMO. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello.
Now, let's start off with the first question. The EU has just granted Ukraine an exemption to spend European defense funds on Chinese drone components. But at the same time, Brussels calls China the key enabler of Russia's war. Has Europe just exposed the limits of its strategic autonomy?
I think this issue really illustrates precisely the predicament that Europe finds itself in right now, because I think all the strands of our discussions come together in this one story, right? We indeed do see the fact that China is still absolutely dominant in the drone manufacturing industry. Ukraine cannot fight the war without Chinese components for its drones. And so the exemption is quite logical, because without the exemption, Ukraine couldn't arm itself. At the same time, of course, we know that the Chinese support for the Russian drone manufacturing is just so much stronger than the support that Ukraine gets. I mean, we hear stories about whole production lines being moved from China to Russia to help the Russian war effort. And I think the inability of the EU to do without Chinese drones is a big challenge that we have to face. But until we have solved this issue, Ukraine just needs the material now.
Do you feel like there is a specific timeline in which Europe can truly reach this strategic autonomy? Because drones, I mean, they're clearly the next frontier of warfare, and we've heard so much about this. But is there a realistic and relatively short timeline where we will reach that industrial capability?
In the short term, not without great expenses. We already see that Taiwanese drones from a so-called China-free supply chain are moving to Poland and Czechia in growing numbers, where allegedly some of them move on to Ukraine, but these drones are much more expensive and in much smaller numbers. So we can't replace China's scale very quickly. The problem also is that even if we manage to replace the drone components coming from China, we still need to find a source for the materials from which we make the drone components, because then we still depend on rare earths and other materials which also are dominated by the Chinese industry. So the whole supply chain is chock full of dependencies on China. And if you really want to achieve this autonomy, you will have to address all of these dependencies all across the chain, from chemicals to minerals to components to chips.
Now, in other recent news, obviously the Commission is set to unveil its planned policy proposal for the carbon pricing system, the ETS, and we've seen 10 countries, including Poland, urging Brussels to rethink that policy proposal, saying that it risks undermining European industry at a time of fierce competition from China. Now, should the industrial capacity that China poses towards the European continent reshape the way we think of our green transition?
I mean, the great success of China's industrial development over the past years depends precisely on these new green energy technologies. So for China, the green turn is pure realpolitik. And so I think also Europe needs to realize that if it wants to compete in this game, it does need to invest and find measures that allow the EU to develop its industries in these areas. The problem, of course, is that the Chinese industries are much more carbon intensive. There's a lot less attention to environmental protection and a lot less attention to the CO2 and other emissions that these industries create. This is also precisely why China has teamed up with India and the US to oppose the EU plans for carbon border adjustment measures, because those three countries have a lot less interest in protecting the environment from these emissions, and they stand to lose quite a bit if we level the playing field between European industries and non-European industries. And I do think that when we look at the ETS plans, we do need to keep in mind that Europe does need to make a shift, because if we follow the playbook that the German car makers kept on for too long, what happens is that you chase the combustion engine of the past while China moves on with the electric vehicle of the future.
Right, and obviously the Commission has given itself and Beijing until October to address these trade imbalances. They're simultaneously preparing for unilateral defense talks and trade defense measures if those talks fail. Now, do you feel like the EU is finally moving from de-risking to a much more confrontational stance against China?
I mean, we have in recent days seen two developments on the EU's approach to China. One is the economic approach, and the other is the security approach, right? So the economic measures which they are currently working on were authorized by the European Council in June, after the member states finally agreed that this is a danger that we have to face now. And I do see this combination of the instruction to the Commission to develop new instruments while engaging in dialogue with Beijing as a political solution to please both member states more reluctant to confront China, but also to keep Beijing happy and not give them too much reason to retaliate too soon. At the same time, of course, last Monday, the Foreign Affairs Council agreed on new language which, for the first time ever at that level, labels China explicitly as a key enabler of Russia's war effort against Ukraine. That is quite an escalation. That's the security front. And my big question is, are we going to see in the coming weeks and months the economic and the security questions intertwine? Because as we just discussed when we talked about the drones, of course, China's industrial capacity and overcapacity plays a direct role in the security threat which China is through its support for Russia.
Right, and obviously we have an increasing overlap between Washington and Brussels. They both increasingly are describing China as their main long-term strategic competitor, yet they continue to diverge on so many issues: tariffs, export controls, economic engagement. What's preventing the West from developing a truly coordinated China policy? And obviously, does Beijing benefit from that?
I mean, Beijing has always been very good at playing of countries against each other. I mean, we already saw this in the Civil War when they managed to play the right-wing and the centrist forces out against each other to win against the Nationalist Party. And of course, even today, we see a very naked attempt by Beijing to both divide the Western camp, but also to divide the EU member states among themselves. Of course, you can't blame them. They need to play their foreign policy just like we have our games to play. But of course, they are using real divisions, and the divide between America and Europe is also based on values, especially under the current American administration, but also because the United States has a very different position to defend. Europe doesn't necessarily have to fight for its place in the world the same way the US have when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. Europe does have a strong interest when it comes to European security and to the future of European industry. And so in that sense, Europe can find a much more social approach to dealing with China, focusing on de-risk rather than decoupling, because there are still areas in which Europe thinks it does have opportunity to work with China. And this, I think, differs quite starkly from the approach in DC, where there is more and more of a consensus among both sides of the aisle that China really is also an ideological danger, which we haven't reached yet in Europe.
Right, and obviously this is another year of the war in Ukraine continuing, and there is a sense of a stalemate, even if the tides are now shifting in Ukraine's favor. We're still in the midst of an ongoing conflict, and
yes.
Does that current stalemate suit Beijing? How does Beijing view the war in its current state right now?
I mean, that's a really good question, because of course Beijing talks about supposed neutrality, while more and more Europeans say that Chinese neutrality is a lie. But I do think we have to start back with our previous discussion about the West, because for China, the current moment really is about the transition, supposedly, between a declining America and a rising developing world with China at the center. And so anything that happens in the world, the Beijing leadership interprets through this lens of conflict. And so for China, the conflict in Ukraine is primarily about America. We saw this early on when they blamed everything on the US, supposedly egging on both the Ukrainians and the EU. And we see it now in some of the expressions allegedly said by Wang Yi, for example, to Kaja Kallas, that there's no interest in Beijing to end the war, because if the war ends, then America is free to focus on Asia again. And so in that sense, China has a lot to gain from this chaos, because the chaos distracts and divides NATO and saps economic life force from Europe. But at the same time, of course, we have seen that this war and China's support for Russia has materially worsened the EU-China relationship. And Beijing keeps complaining about how this is unfair, because Beijing's approach to the war, or conflict as they call it, or crisis, is supposedly even-handed. But the reality is that Europe no longer, and increasingly little, accepts this attitude from Beijing. And so we saw this Monday when they adopted the language. This is part of a gradual escalation of the EU attitude towards China, and Beijing will increasingly have to deal with the alienation that they have created here in Brussels.
And how would you say the relationship between China and Russia has evolved over these past few years? Because I've seen very conflicting reporting.
Yes.
Obviously, we see the recent statement from the EU saying that they are a key enabler in Russia's war, but I've also seen reports saying that there's growing division between Russia and China, where China is now treating Russia as almost a secondary partner for themselves. How would you describe that relationship at the current point?
I mean, the Russian relationship has always been the most important diplomatic relationship for Beijing for as long as the Federation has existed. Based on my own research into diplomatic data, I have seen that Russia has been by far the most important diplomatic partner of Beijing going back to the 90s. And even before that, in the 80s, when the Soviet Union was dissolving, Beijing spent lots of effort on restoring the relationship with Moscow because they have such a long and sparsely populated border. And so it's vital for China to have a good relationship with Russia, no matter what. Of course, since those 80s and 90s, China has gotten quite a lot further on when it comes to technology and global power. So Russia has become less and less important as a source for example, military technology. But there still are some areas in which Russia is ahead of China, both in terms of experience on the actual battlefield, but also in terms of specialized technology when it comes to submarines, for example, or air attack helicopter landings. And these are things which China needs if they want to credibly threaten Taiwan. And what they have been doing is using Russia's weak position in the Ukraine war to force Moscow to give more knowledge away. I mean, recently we had this whole expose by Der Spiegel and other European media, which exposed the depth of this technological cooperation between Russia and China. These are areas in which Russia in the past would have never shared so much detail, so much know-how. But they have no choice because they need other technology like the drones from China. And of course, China is now in a position to demand much more than Russia is isolated. So it's a matter of convenience, also because they share a similar outlook on how the world should be reorganized. But it's also simply because Russia has no other partner of the same skill.
Sensei, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned to TVP World for more news and updates. I'm Laura Hazanov in the Brussels studio.